Not bad. Today I came in because I'm late. Today I...
Okay, we'll get started here. It's my pleasure to introduce Dr. Alan Lloyd. He's currently a senior research fellow in the Energy Institute at UT Austin. He earned both his BS in chemistry and PhD in gas kinetics at the University College of Wales in the UK. He was one of the founding members and served as the president of the International Council on Clean Transportation, the ICCT, from 2006 to 2013. Before the ICCT, Dr. Lloyd was the secretary of the California Environmental Protection Agency, appointed by Governor Arnold Schwarzenegger in 2004. And as secretary, he led the governor's climate action team to develop a plan to reduce greenhouse gas emissions in California to 80% of 1990 levels. Dr. Lloyd also served as the chairman of the Air Resources Board, sometimes also called CARB, the California Air Resources Board, appointed by Governor Gray Davis in 1999, and was reappointed by Governor Schwarzenegger in 2004. Prior to joining CARB, Dr. Lloyd was the executive director of the Energy and Environmental Engineering Center for the Desert Research Institute at the University and Community College System of Nevada, Reno, and also the chief scientist at the South Coast Air Quality Management District from 1988 to 1996. The focus of his research is the role of hydrogen in a sustainable society, fuel cells, electric drive vehicles, renewable energy, and policies to promote zero emissions vehicles. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Lloyd for his presentation.
Thank you very much, Dave. It's a pleasure to be here. Dave warned me that there was spring break, so the audience would be slightly depleted, but nice to see you here indeed. And again, it's a pleasure to work with my colleagues at the Energy Institute. I realize, I hope you find this interesting. As I put it together, it's actually quite interesting to see what happened in California and how things have emerged. I also realize, however, coming to Texas, talking about California is not necessarily the most, can be dangerous, put it that way. At least it will spark discussion there one way or another, particularly in terms of the jobs, fighting for jobs and taxation, free market, etc. As you'll see going through, market differences here between the approaches. Anyway, what I'm hoping to cover... Can you hear okay? Great. Well, what I'm covering here will be brief background, then some of the air quality trends, which I recently attended 50th anniversary of the California Air Resources Board, and taking some of their slides, some key events during that period. Then I'd give some specific examples of science-based policies. While I talk about environmental policies, most of mine are based on air pollution, climate change, not necessarily water policies there. But I think it was worthwhile reminding myself some of the science-based policies, which these days doesn't seem to be as well regarded in certain quarters. And then the diesel-related issues, both the why diesel lagged behind in sales in the US, and then talking about the VW scandal. Setting of the tailpipe standards for greenhouse gases, and then putting in context with the 2050 targets for greenhouse gas reductions in California that Dave mentioned. And then just talking about California and global leadership, how that's spread. So This is typical Los Angeles air quality in the 60s, and it's typical today, bad days in Beijing or Delhi, and you've seen much worse than that. I came to California 10 years later than that, about 1970, and was witness to really what was going on in that cases. And you can see what's happened here. You can see where in the 60s and 70s, you can see the ozone levels here, how high they were in that period of time. You can see the 8-hour ozone, nearly way above, those are the number of days, in that case, over the standards here. So, but the trend you should point out is how that's gone down over a period of time. And then you can see the number of cars. So air quality has improved significantly in spite of the growth in cars. And you'll see a little bit more, some specifics there in terms of the actual pollutants. And then you can see along the way, when the Air Resources Board adopted the first NOx standard for cars, first three-way catalytic converter was in California, control on power plants, cleaner burning gasoline, and advanced clean cars. So you can get an idea of how you move through that. And so this, for example, talks about ozone. When I first came to California, this was quite typical, where you'd get numbers here above 0.5 or 500 parts per billion, which was a stage 3, an emergency where people would have to go indoors. And then there was a stage 2 and a stage 1. You can see how that basically moved out. So in fact, that there was no stage 3 alerts. And how in fact, just after 2000, stage 1 alerts went there. And this is for the South Coast Air Quality Management District. So quite a success story in that case. Now in this time period, not only was ozone there, but also there was an oxidant called peroxyacetyl nitrate, PAN, and that was a strong eye irritant. So people complained about runny eyes, etc. And you may find some of that now if you go to Delhi or if you go to Beijing or some of the highly polluted cities around the world. This you can see how things have come down over a period of time. Population has increased, the number of trip miles. So today the population in California is it's about 38 million people, larger than Canada. Texas, put in perspective, is about 28, 29 million people. So you can see population increased, number of vehicle increased, trip miles, gross state product. In spite of all that, the policies have worked to reduce carbon monoxide, sulfur dioxide, nitrogen dioxide, and the ozone you saw previously. So you can see in this case that just looking at pollutant levels have decreased. Premature deaths, a very success story there. Economic value of health benefits exceeds $250 billion. Environmental justice communities have initially lagged behind, but the gap is growing, and I'll say some of that towards the end. And you can see direct air pollution control costs are less than 1% of the gross state product there, but have led to the creation of 42,000 jobs and revenue of $8 billion in the air pollution control industry alone. So when people tell you that you can't afford it, well, I think the numbers that they've put together shows that it can be afforded, and to protect public health is a major driver and is the driver in California. Just briefly, administrative structure in California, the Air Resources Board created in '67. Board members have prescribed skills. You have to have an engineer, you have to have a medical person, etc., all appointed by the governor at the pleasure, which means that if he or she is unhappy with you, you can be dismissed overnight. There are 35 air districts which take care of the station resources. Air Resources Board addresses transportation and consumer products. California had the benefit of its grandfathered under the Clean Air Act amendments, which means that California is the only state that could set its own tailpipe standards for cars. States can opt into adopting the California standards, but they can't have a separate standard. So you have 9 other states which have opted in to the California program. So you see this is why California, because of its adverse air quality early on, could set its own standards. And typically, the success has been built on technology forcing standards. By that I mean you set a standard, a tight standard, which will basically, you may not know exactly what the technology is at that time, but you give the industry sufficiently long to actually come up with a way of technology to meet those standards. This is just a recounting of some of the first for California. Lead-free gasoline, emission controls with a 3-way catalyst, and DPFs, diesel particulate filters for diesels, I mentioned that. NOx control for ozone and PM, low sulfur fuels. And you can see here the percentage of world vehicles new engine standards first demonstrated in California. Again, great success story. Now I'd like to move into some specific examples contributing to that success and going beyond it. And these are examples where I trace what the science behind these. Talk about the so-called Hagenschmidt discovery. And I'll say more. Hagenschmidt, he was basically the discoverer of photochemical smog in LA. The catalytic converter, hydrocarbon control based on reactivity, methanol and cleaner burning gasoline, spill-proof gas cans, pretty mundane, but there's a good story behind that. The ZEV Mandate, that's the zero emission vehicle requirement for new cars sold, and the CFCs, phase out fluorocarbons. While this was not part of CARB, it was discovered in California. And the asterisk there showed the example here of the initial results were all deny the result from the regulated community, deny the results and fight regulatory action. Not all of them, but you can see in those examples there. Professor Hagenschmidt, he was basically a perfume chemist at Caltech. You can see the sophisticated instrumentation he was using at that stage in his car as he drove around. And he actually used to measure ozone concentration in the atmosphere by stretching rubber bands and how fast they would break, how fast they would actually, you could see the pieces coming in there. That was a way of the concentration, because at that time also rubber on cars, they would crack and they wouldn't last until they put some antioxidant in there. So that's at that time. And so he was the one who then discovered here, because, you know, smog comes from smoke and fog. And the old smoke in the London, the Pennsylvania days, that was basically from the SO2 and fog getting together. This was different. This was called photochemical smog, because it was generated by hydrocarbons, nitrogen oxides in the presence of sunlight, which could produce ozone as well as other oxidants like formaldehyde, PAN, as I mentioned there. So very different. And it took a while for people to understand that. Hydrocarbon and NOx significantly coming from the automobile. That was identified. As I mentioned there, the results were attacked. And as Professor Hagenschmidt mentioned here, he said at first that's the auto industry representatives, were very quiet. Then they laughed at me and tried to discredit me. Then there was a war. They said my work was not scientific, but major studies that cost much more than mine were undertaken, and they all had reached the same conclusion. You can't beat the truth. Still true today. But the industry at that time had contracted with Stanford Research Institute to basically refute what was happening here. And that then underpinned the work that was going on to address that. because once you identified you had hydrocarbon, you obviously can't control the sun. You then have hydrocarbons and NOx, which are creating ozone and other oxidants. I won't go into all the details over the years where you're fighting how much NOx control, how much hydrocarbon control, and the differences across the basin. But that suffice to say, that set you on the path then of saying, these are two emittents, pollutants that we want to reduce. That led then into the catalytic converter. So the nitrogen oxides and hydrocarbon cars were identified as a big problem. So putting a catalytic converter in the exhaust stream, this was invented after many years. Well, first of all, denial, and then they could see a way with this had come about. And first of all, it was a two-way catalyst. We just reduced hydrocarbons and CO. But then you had the three-way, which then also reduced nitrogen oxides. To do that, you had eventually get to lead-free gasoline and also sulfur reductions. So you'll see in some parts of the world, it's very difficult to get the catalyst on unless you get a low sulfur fuel. So that they go hand in hand, because sulfur is just a poison catalyst, same as lead. Significant impact in terms of the improvement of air quality. Hydrocarbon control. It's another piece you look at, and this is generally hydrocarbon control. What was recognized that the hydrocarbon decayed at different rates. That is things like ethylene, butadiene, they'd react very quickly in the atmosphere. Things like octane and whatnot, much slower. Methane at that time was basically, I mentioned, not considered. Then the role of the hydroxyl radical was also discovered in photochemical smog. Some of that by research actually at Ford Motor Company. And all the car companies and the oil companies had major research programs at that stage. And in fact, when I came to the country, I was working on OH radical reactions in the stratosphere. Now you can see, got me into this, in terms of the photochemical smog in the lower atmosphere. Reactivity scales based on OH reactivity would, oh, why have I, oh, I see why. Wrong, didn't use this. Scales were based on OH reactivity. So rather than saying across the board we'll control all the hydrocarbons, you gave some priority to those that reacted more rapidly. And so you can see that, and as I mentioned there, people were talking about non-methane hydrocarbons. Methane was not a priority at all, because this was air quality focuses. This is before greenhouse gases, before methane as a greenhouse gas contributor. Again, I think this showed up very much in terms of the benefits of targeting the controls, taking out the most reactive first of all. Also in the late 80s, the agencies were concerned that the car companies were not doing enough to reduce tailpipe emissions. So one of the things they looked at was methanol. Methanol was pretty clean burning. You could get down to some fairly low emissions from methanol. It's already partially oxidized. So California started a program where they actually implemented putting methanol stations in the state, and they had car companies out there. In the end, they got up to close to 20,000 methanol vehicles on the road. The oil companies were not very happy with that. They didn't want to market methanol because methanol can blind you and is poisonous. So while they complied with what they required, they said, well, let us see if we can do a better way. So they got together with the auto companies, and they developed what was called cleaner burning gasoline. And it was a pretty sound program through the Coordinating Research Council. And I was on a group at that time just to oversee what was going on and to validate that piece of it. And so as a result, they came up what they called cleaner burning gasoline. and it was ARCO coming up with EC1, and it moved. So they developed that program. As a result, then the methanol program gradually went away. Some people were pretty unhappy with that. The part of that, they used MTBE, that's methyl tertiary butyl ether, as an oxidant in terms of the gasoline. And so that improved the combustion, got you cleaner burning. But the irony was that in 2000, late in 2000, MTBE was banned. The governor, in fact, when I was there, Governor Davis issued a ban saying basically within 6 months MTBE has to be phased out. One of the reasons for that was that it was building up in surface water in lakes, and it wasn't biodegradable. Methanol as an alcohol was biodegrading, and ether was not biodegrading, and it was bad for you. So it's an interesting story how those things are tied together. But today, of course, we have much cleaner burning gasoline along the way. Another piece here where science came into developing a whole strategy. In terms of looking at many field studies were carried out in LA during over all these years to try to figure out where all the emissions were coming from. And one of those, you looked at the composition of the atmosphere, and then you looked at the emission inventory. And staff had found out that there was a much greater concentration of unburned hydrocarbons than they could account for. So these weren't olefins or alcohols that may be part of the cracking process. And so they suspected some evaporative sources, which were not controlled. Then they said, well, maybe we should take a look at gas cans. People store them in the garage. They use them for boats and whatnot. And so they took these gas cans, selection of those, put them in what they call a shed test, which is basically an enclosure, and measured the evaporation and the concentration. And lo and behold, they found this stuff was spewing out many hydrocarbons, and as the temperature increased. So a regulation was imposed then which controlled the permeability of the cans, so you had to put either thick plastic or you had to put some barrier in there, and you had to be spill proof. And you'll see that today, you go to Home Depot and whatnot, these cans, they can be a pain, but they're spill proof. But again, based on that, it wasn't idly come across. ZEV mandate, you either like it or not. A lot of the auto companies didn't like it, but it's very interesting. It's driven by the need to eliminate emissions from the tailpipe. And so this is a regulation that was started in 1991. It's part of a suite of programs, and one part of it was the ZEV mandate, which is the one that gets recommended. And staff recognized from the modeling, even if you took all the cars off the road in Los Angeles, you couldn't meet the air quality standards. So they had seen this General Motors EV1 coming after the solar race in Australia, and they said, oh gee, we got a vehicle here. And as the industry says, sometimes if you show the regulator something, then you're forced to adopt it. So that's what happened. So regulation were put in, so say that 5% of new car sales in 1998 must be zero emission. Well, of course, the story, the rest of the story is that this has been modified many times, but it's still a driver for this country and continue to drive the EV movement in China as well, because China now also has a similar so-called ZEV mandate. So it's as I mentioned, you also have now various states who have actually opted into the California program. They have an obligation for ZEVs. So you'll see many more battery electric vehicles in those states than, for example, Texas, where you don't get a credit for that part of it. Because if you're part of the ZEV states, you can actually get some credit for selling those or selling in California and attributing there. That's so-called travel provision, which goes away in 2018. So you can see here the global electric vehicle sales, how this is surging, and these data come from ICCT, but they're generated as of January 2017. So you can see the major slug, where that's coming from. You can see China just going upwards here. And many parts of the world, and particularly you can see places like the Netherlands, Norway, where they have very good subsidies going there. And now the number is probably up over 3 million, with China taking off very strong. This also shows you how people are responding, how the companies are responding. So if you look here at the early part of that, you can see relatively few companies making them. Now you can see in 2016, look at the variety of companies that are selling electric vehicles. And I say that's probably just increasing. But so the idea that you're stuck with just one manufacturer is not the case. And these are in different parts of the world. So to me, a great success story. You look at the US, where's the electric vehicle uptake? Mostly in the ZEV states. As you can see, a little bit over here, but these are lagging. And Austin shows up. Thank you, Dave. So, then you can see also, these are the markets around the world that we're pushing this along. And you can see concentrated here, Europe, where you got very good subsidies, and of course, China. India will be picking up along the way. So we move on now to another example here of the CFC phase out. While that's fluorocarbons essentially, were used because they lacked reactivity. They weren't contributing to ozone, so they used as solvents and many other things there. Professor Rowland and Molina at UC Irvine, particularly Professor Rowland, wondered, well, what happens to these? Where do they go to? So then they discovered that they went into the stratosphere and reacted in the stratosphere. Basically, they broke down and you had chlorine radicals which would then attack the oxygen there, and also you wouldn't prevent them from making as much ozone. So basically you've got the ozone hole. So the irony thing, you want ozone in the upper atmosphere to protect you from the UV. You want to get rid of it at ground level where it's affecting your health. So this led to the ban of the CFCs through the Montreal Protocol in 1987. And this has been regarded as the most successful environmental policy regulation by the international community. And probably not just for CFCs, because CFCs are also very potent greenhouse gases, up to 10,000 times as potent as CO2. So in fact, it's playing a role in fact reducing, addressing climate change, because they have a big impact. Clearly not nearly as many molecules as CO2, but on a per molecule basis, very much. And of course, Nobel Prizes went to Rowland and Molina in 1995 for this. Again, science coming from the lab directly here and back to the benefit of all of us. Diesel-related issues. Well, I could talk here for another half hour, but I've got to be careful of this here. California first recognized diesel particulate as a toxic air contaminant and a potential carcinogen in about 1999. They have a process there what they call the risk assessment, and that's done by the Office of OHIHA, Office of Environmental Health Hazard Assessment. It's part of Cal EPA. So they took 10 years of pretty rigorous debate, contentious debate, and they concluded after that time that it was a toxic air contaminant, diesel particulate, and a potential carcinogen. That then meant that they had to come up with a risk management plan. So the diesel risk reduction plan was introduced in 2000. And in part of that, a Moya fund was set up to provide financial incentives for cleaner trucks. and I think later on here I've got an example. They set up $150 million per year over 10 years. One of the hallmarks of California, which I don't see in Texas at the moment, California spent a tremendous lot of public money to help implement these programs. It comes from a variety of sources, and the legislature appropriates that. Also, you had an era here of tighter standards for NOx, tighter standard for NOx and PM, which were affecting diesel, because California also adopted a regulation in the late 90s. Basically said no matter what the fuel, they have to meet the same standards. Well, trying to get the diesel to meet the spark ignition one, NOx was a problem, and that's why, in fact, when I was there, I had a number of times the manufacturers coming to me and saying, well, can you relax the NOx standards so we can sell cars? And the answer was always, we will not accommodate your cars. You can sell the cars when you meet the standards. So we're not going to relax the standards so your cars can meet them. We'll set the standards, and then once you meet those, great. And of course, that was the issue that led to the VW scandal, because it becomes very difficult to meet these standards. And it's like hanging so many things on a tree here led to the VW scandal. Because in order to meet those standards, first of all, the tailpipe, you've got to put a diesel oxidation catalyst on. Then you've got a diesel particulate filter. Then you've got to put an SCR, selective catalytic reduction, to knock down the NOx. All of those got to be working perfectly over the lifetime of the car before you have to show that. So it meant it was very difficult for people, so it took a long time. I never thought they would do it, but I was on record as saying, well, I think they can do it because I've seen the progress. Unfortunately, you can't account for cheating. So this led to, I think I've covered this here because this shows you the retrofit program. But get on to what they call Dieselgate. And the background here, the way it was found out, in Europe, they found out that on-road emissions were greater than the standards. And there was that major difference, and could be up to a factor of 40. ICCT, when I was there, a few of the staff, including John, Joe, and Peter Mock, they said, well, that doesn't happen in the US. We've got much better enforcement and compliance in the US. So why don't we look at what's happened in the US? So they contracted with the University of West Virginia, and lo and behold, they found that VW also had excursions up to 40% in terms of the on-road vehicle, 40 times on-road vehicle emissions. And this was a big surprise. So they didn't set out to trap that. But getting back, here's the examples for Europe. So you can see here, these are actual, these are the various classes, but here are the standards, and you can see the cars and what the actual numbers want. You can see how high they are compared to that. So you can see it can be, here's a standard 1, way up there. So this has first triggered that part of it, and this is with the light-duty vehicles. Now you can see for Euro 6 diesel, which is tighter standards, similar situation, maybe not quite as bad. But you can see these should all be down here, like this. And you can see, so in the States, Audi and VW were the main culprits. Now some people are looking at other manufacturers. So this is the way it started out, because in the cities now, you will see, sorry, not jumping ahead of myself. Well, I mentioned this, I think. So the other piece of that was the regulatory agencies, both the Air Resources Board and EPA, once they were presented with the results from the researchers, they went back to VW and said, well, how do you explain that? Well, my understanding, talking with the people, they went back them several times with basically a BS explanation, and the engineers didn't buy it, particularly ARB said, no, we don't buy that at all. So in the end, they were forced, because they said, look, if you don't explain that, you're not going to be able to sell any more cars. They then admitted that they were cheating. What was happening, the software in there, similar to what happened with the heavy-duty vehicles, by the way, 10 years ago. The software, once you're on the test cycle in the lab, and you know what the test cycle is acceleration, deceleration, cruise, and whatnot, the software recognizes that. And so in this case, they were able to put enough reductant in their urea that the NOx levels, they complied. Once you got out on the road, the software said, oh, this is another test cycle. Now we can maximize for performance. So we can have better fuel economy on the road. And so they weren't doping it in the same way they should have been in there. And apparently, even in some cases, the software could recognize whether the person was turning the steering wheel. How that was done, but VW went to a lot of redo that. And of course, they were admitted finding. And then, of course, they were fined 14.7 billion by the Department of Justice. They're affecting 10.5 million vehicles worldwide, about 500,000 vehicles in the US. They've got to provide 2.7 billion to the states to reduce NOx. So they've got to come up with a way of offsetting that NOx. Texas gets 209 million of that, and Texas is in the middle of deciding how to use that. VW is also required to spend $2 billion over 10 years in green energy and EVs. That is, they're going to invest in something that they can't fiddle around with the tailpipe emissions since there aren't any. So a big lesson for that, which is a lesson to the rest of the world as well. I think that's, well, the other piece I wanted to say there, the irony is that if you, a few weeks ago, some of the environmental groups in Germany sued the federal government, I think the federal government over there, or sued some of the cities. And the court came down and said the cities can actually ban diesel vehicles in these cities, which for Germany was a tremendous thing for diesel vehicles. And the cities can do it, doesn't have to come from the state level. So diesels are in for a tough time on that part of it. Although, of course, heavy duty, you still haven't got a good replacement for that. But as long as everything works, you know, they're sufficiently clean to meet the standards. Moving to climate change concerns. And now we're going through the 90s into about 2000. And this is at the time when California added climate change to the legislative priorities. Prior to that time, California was really mostly worried about tailpipe emissions, criteria pollutants. And in fact, my European friends used to come over and say, you know, it's all about CO2. Why aren't you worried about climate change? Why aren't you worried about that? You know, we've solved our NOx problem, we solved the ozone problem. That was at that time. Of course, they haven't solved it yet. We used to say, we need them both. We need to meet the greenhouse gas standards and the criteria pollutant standards. And in Europe at the moment, the cities are impacted. There are 80 cities in Germany which don't meet the NOx standard, NO2 standards set by the European community. So they've not solved that problem. Although and that's why they've shown priority for diesels, because they had better fuel economy. Anyway, California decided that. The history of this is interesting because this was my first year as chair, that one there. And in fact, it was one of the environmental groups there, I think it was Blue Water Network, Russell Long, who actually went to this woman, ex-teacher Fran Pavley, wonderful person there. She was a fresh woman, and they always looked to introduce some legislation. And she said, well, why don't we get CARB to set tailpipe standard for CO2? Well, of course, CERB can't set standard for CO2 because only the federal government can set fuel economy standards. So after 2 years of a bill, it was finally passed. It was a major story of how that got passed. Even though one weekend I went home expecting it to be dead. Next Monday I got back, it appeared again with a different number, AB now 1493, passed by 1 vote. And so we were charged then, so once that was introduced, they directed us then to come up a way to address greenhouse gases from cars. And this is where, in fact, Governor Davis signed the legislation. Schwarzenegger signed the regulation. It was implemented when he was there. The companies, of course, sued California. Opportunities for cooperation were basically discarded. They didn't want anything to do with it. We didn't want California touching anything to do with climate and whatnot. And even some of the major environmental groups in Washington at that time were not in favor of California going alone. They said, we'll work at the federal level. Once they realized nothing was happening in Washington, they provided great support to California. And of course, California won the lawsuit in that case. And this is where the standard was set up. They were phased in over 6 years. You can see what the targets were compared to 2009. They had certain stipulation in the legislation which we had to abide by, and that is that it had to be off-the-shelf technology which was widely available. You had to have at least a less than a 5-year payback to the owner in savings, and we were assuming $1.9 a gallon of gasoline at that time, which is actually, well, of course, now, anytime you go above that, you get a shorter payback period. We're also required, in deference to the farmers in the Central Valley, we could not ban trucks. So we had to be very careful in circumnavigating that. And you can see what this meant in terms of the near term and the long term. So you can see lesser for the heavier trucks, and this is the midterm here. Subsequently, of course, California worked with the federal government to come in with nationwide standards after 2015. So that took over there, and that now is in effect to supposedly 2025 or 2022. As you know, it's going under review by the current administration. Now we moved from the cars, and California all of a sudden decided that, they've bitten the bullet now on climate change, getting major applause from various parts of the world. Other parts of the world were moving on climate change, and so California decided that it wanted to be more aggressive on that. So on UN Day in California, in San Francisco, Governor Schwarzenegger at that time, who was now in charge, and in fact you could say it took a European here to march on in terms of climate change for California. And basically said that, I say the debate is over, we know the science, we see the threat, and we know time for action is now. So you can see this was his executive order. Now recognize executive orders doesn't have the full bearing of legislation. But, and the basis for those numbers, to be quite honest with you, at that time, were a little bit better, I think, than Tony Blair was looking at in the UK. And so there was that little bit of rivalry. So the governor said, well, we'll do 80% below 1990 levels by 2050. Climate Action Team was to put together this report showing that how it could be done, and making sure that those were feasible numbers to date. This just shows you the magnitude of what you're requiring, and it's pretty sobering in a way. because you can see in order to meet these goals, on the right-hand side, the California per capita greenhouse gas tons per person. So you can see where it is in 1990, 14.62, and you're trying to get down to 1.47 per capita in 2050. And obviously that the population, we've already seen the population now here, just below here, is close to 40 million. So that's going up. So it's a pretty ambitious target. And this gives you, in 2003, what the typical per capita US CO2 emission, greenhouse gas emissions are. So, you know, you can throw up your hands and say, well, that's pretty well impossible. But typically, you obviously look at ways in which you can reduce that. Even if you can't get all the way, you're going to make significant strides. This then led to the California Global Warming Solution Act of 2006. And now the legislature put in writing and put in legislation what basically the governor had in his executive order. This time they didn't go out to 2050. They went out to 2020 and they would go to 2030. But you can see they had various things required there. And in fact, you can see it was pretty wide-ranging since they were going for various industries, including utilities, oil refineries. The car regulations were already well underway, and they were suggesting that you had market-based compliance mechanisms, including the impacts on environmental justice communities. So this was a pretty, and it still is, basically a landmark piece of legislation, which has now been expanded through SB 32 out until 2050 with similar targets in these cases. I think it's, and I should also recognize, while I've been talking about CARB, the Energy Commission and the Public Utility Commission play substantial roles also in meeting those targets. So the Energy Commission has a very impressive record of addressing energy efficiency in appliances and buildings. And in fact, their work on refrigeration, they've got phenomenal numbers where you can have the refrigerator uses a fraction of the energy that they used to have, and that's percolated a lot through appliances and into buildings. And of course, the U.S. Similarly, but California set a lot of the pathway for those stringent standards. Public Utility Commission, similar to what they are in Texas, also set aggressive renewable energy requirements, which will be necessary in order to meet those targets. I think getting to the end here, I think it's very important, the air pollution used has been used by an example for many of the cities and countries in China, India, Mexico City. And California has based that on public health. And you will notice that in China and in India, public health has been the driver. They're not as concerned about greenhouse gas at this stage, but of course they go hand in hand since it's one. Public health and the fact that people could see the pollution, see the impact on health, required then action by the government. And so this health-based air quality standards, which are reduced over a period of time as more information is gained about the sensitivity to pollutants, and that you have smaller numbers there where people, smaller concentration where people are impacted with their health. I think technology, which typically starts in California, migrates globally. We've seen that. California has many memoranda of understanding between California and the global region. And so trying to take some of the lessons learned from California, and most of them are good, but there are some bad ones you don't want, like the empty. And California's cap and trade program addressing climate change is being adopted for China, for example. And the cap-and-trade program and allowances led to California having millions and billions of dollars to address these issues. So I think in conclusion there, you can see, I think it's demonstrated that the air pollution has been dramatically reduced. So the idea there's not been a trade-off between environmental protection and public health, you can, and a vibrant economy. You can have both. Now, obviously, there are dips along the way, as in any state. I think the success was based on science and technology forcing regulations, and that's worked. Today, you go into the cap and trade, I think it's still, to me, we still have to make sure that that will have the same track record as technology force and regulation. However, there's still non-attainment areas in California because, as I mentioned, because we know more about public health, the standards have been reduced. As a result, you can't emit as much in the atmosphere. Plus the fact you also get some migration of pollution across the Pacific, which brings up some of the background. Much more focus on environmental justice areas in California. In fact, when I was at the Air Resource Board, we have 11 board members. I think there are now 15. I think 4 of those are heavily focused on environmental justice. As I mentioned, California commits mega dollars to clean up, so there's major opportunities for people coming in, manufacturers to come in, after treatment people to come in, and to address air pollution and climate change. Obviously, as I mentioned there, the greenhouse gas reduction targets remain a major challenge. There's still very aggressive work going on. Governor Brown has got even more there. For example, he wants 2,000, I think it's 2,000 charging stations. Not 2,000, 2 million, I think. About 4,000 of those to be in rapid charging stations, 10,000. 4,000 being rapid charging stations by 20. Your portfolio standard has gone up, so we're looking at eventually going to 100%. So that continues to work very strongly. And California, I think, has the luxury that the population is very committed to the environment. So you can't have that support unless you have the education, unless of the public, and you have this commitment of the public to provide the legislators with the money to help out that part of it. So I think it's a good story. A lot remains to be done, and obviously meeting those targets on greenhouse gases is going to be a major one. But I think it's important that at least you're trying on that. So with that, happy to answer some questions.
Take some questions.
Thank you for the wonderful talk. I had a question regarding the amount of money that CARB or say South Coast AQMD are investing in research versus the amount being invested in regulation. Like what's the division been usually? So as you showed that there's been a lot of research-based policy. What's the percentage division between the two basically?
I didn't quite get the question.
Oh, so what I was asking was that CARB as a regulatory body and you know South Coast AQMD, they would be allocating their budget to regulation itself and then to research, since that's what they are using to drive their policy. Yep. What's been the fractional allocation to different?
Oh, at ARB and at South Coast?
Right, yeah.
The budget, the research budget per se is not great at ARB. Maybe it's about 10 million. That's pure research. But there's a lot of stuff that goes outside of that which provides funding to look at technologies, etc. And in fact, South Coast, they probably have a much smaller research budget, but they have a very robust, they have about $100 million for what they call technology advancement, so they can bring in new technologies into there. I was there, we started running that program. You would leverage that 4 to 5 to 1. So they have a huge, that's $500 million to, in fact, bring in the technology, demonstrate there, or pay for like electric school buses, or basically try to electrify the ports. So a lot of money.
I have a question. So in the past couple of weeks, there was an article that was published in Science that looked at what are the current main sources of volatile organic compounds in LA, and because this reacts and then transforms into ozone and PM, right? And they saw that currently, because all that you talk in your talk, the transportation sector is a little bit lesser than consumer products, that at least in urban areas, now consumer products are really important sources of emission of VOC. And in your talk, you briefly confirmed that there's an agency that regulates consumer products. So could you talk a little bit more about that? Because it seems in the future that will be more relevant to reduce emissions.
The Air Resources Board regulates consumer products. Yeah, but I think I saw that same article. And but what that demonstrates, that really the controls on some of these other sources have got pretty low. And, they're identifying a potential source there of more emissions. So to me, when I looked at that, I said, well, yeah, knowing that a long time, to me, there was nothing new in that, because it means that maybe that needs to get more attention, because you have sort of basically millions of small point sources with the consumer products, but also showing the success of reducing it from other sources. Except that case is VOC, but from a public health viewpoint, particulate and fine particulate are more hazardous to your health than some of the VOCs.
Thank you, Professor, for that talk. I just had a question regarding Dieselgate. I mean, it's very interesting that, Dieselgate had sort of its origins in, the California code. Although, at least to my knowledge, diesel isn't a very popular fuel, at least in the U.S. for cars. It's not. So, I mean, why was it so stringent? California was so tough on diesel? Because, for example, you just think that they wouldn't really consider it a big problem. I mean, it just surprised me from when you said that. I mean, even with the University of West Virginia and all of that, that the entire Dieselgate started in the U.S., which is a country that barely uses diesel for cars. So,
well, I think it's used that in the U.S. The initial discovery was in Europe, where there was a major difference between the tests, certification tests in the dyno, and compared to the real world. They set out to show, well, in the U.S. that doesn't happen. But it did happen. But the reason I mentioned earlier, the reason you don't see many diesels, at least you didn't, because you had a policy that no matter what the fuel, the emissions standard should be the same. So, for example, if you're looking at the PM, well, the PM is a little bit different because you don't have as much PM from gasoline. But in terms of the NOx particularly, if you were looking at a diesel engine or a gasoline engine, the regulator said, doesn't matter, you've got to meet that same NOx standard. And if you recognize if your NOx emissions are based on how that's converted in the atmosphere to NO2 or ozone, it doesn't matter whether it comes from diesel or whether it comes from gasoline. Why should you be allowed to pollute the air more because you have a diesel rather than some of the gasoline? So that's why it was delayed coming into thing. Of course, heavy duty is slightly different because the standards were not as strict, and you need that part of it. So I think it was found in Europe, but it's got the name over here, obviously, for Dieselgate for obvious reasons. Yeah.
Thank you very much. Skylar Doan, Geological Department. Great talk. I learned a lot, actually. So I have a higher level question. So just like the ozone problem we had, the air pollution is a global problem, even essentially. It's a global issue, global challenge. So as more countries develop, like China, like India, like many more countries, where you see the biggest challenge? Is it, you mentioned a few, is it education of the public? Is it research, or is it policymaker, or the funding?
Good question. I think the first one is leadership. You have to have leadership coming from the government. And you have to have that research to back that up. And you obviously have to have an educated public too. But, take China. Everybody knew there was a major problem with air pollution there. The government wasn't doing anything. If you recollect, it was the former U.S. ambassador to China who released the results of PM, showing that they were way above the levels there. And then, of course, you've got a lot of smart people in China now. There's a growing population. They understand. And so they put pressure on the government, and particularly in Beijing, they've reacted. So all of those work in conjunction. As I mentioned before, California has the luxury. They've got a strong leadership at the top, legislative. A group I really probably didn't pay enough tribute to is the environmental community. Environmental community plays a tremendous role in keeping the regulators on their toes, as well as making sure the industry is there too, because they have the education. But it's very difficult, as we see now, even on things like, well, I won't pick an example, but unless you get leadership. Well, I'll take an example. Okay, the current leadership there, unless you get leadership on climate change coming there, it doesn't work. At the state level, it's working. Now we see, we see that in China, in India, one of the most powerful groups, the Center for Science and the Environment, and very aggressive people there. The people in Germany, environmental group DUH, they're the ones who actually sued to get the cities to ban diesel. Again, so that they play a very important role. Similar over here, you got EDF, UCS, NRDC, and other groups who play very important.
I was in the, oh sorry, what do you want? Okay. I was in the Oklahoma City area a couple of years ago working with the energy industry over there, and Scott Pruitt, who heads the EPA now, he came out of that industry, and from what I can tell, I mean, they have fairly big plans. You mentioned leadership in terms of changing the entire terms of the debate, in terms of essentially moving toward a situation in which the environmental community and activism will be kind of, treated as the kind of the burden of proof will be on them. So just curious, what are your thoughts, I mean, with this type of leadership that is now in power?
Well, I think I'm biased, but I can point out there, and having lived through a lot of that, the success of strong leadership, strong enforcement has led to positive results for the public. I see some of the things that's being rolled back now, including today. I was just reading somewhere that they're even rolling back some of the control requirements for VOCs and whatnot on some oil and gas operations. Well, we know that NOx and things create problems. So I don't understand why you would want to deny what's happening there and basically not regulate some of those. Because I think very often, I think a change from where you had with Hagenschmidt in those early years, and even in the mid 80s and 90s, and mid 80s, I think the industry is now much more receptive because they have families as well. They want to do that. So the idea that as long as you give them a clear path, provide some certainty, I think there's a willingness to do that. But absent, gets back to your question, absent leadership at the top, then you go backwards, and it percolates down. So to me, public health is so important, and the U.S. is so important as a leader. It's sad to see things are being, the hallmark is being how many regulations can you roll back, rather than what major impact can you make to protect public health and to protect the environment.
Hi, Alan. Nice to see you. And I walked in a little late, so you might have covered this. But first, I just wanted to respond to the earlier question. The question is not burden of proof, but it's a massive denial of proof at every level that's going on. And when science itself is questioned, then we are questioning civilization at some level as well. So that's just a comment. But coming to the question, California has a very special status in the federal regime in the US on the environment. I do believe they have a way to override federal law, or California law is often the gold standard in the US and not the federal law, as you have shown. And federal law cannot override California law in a certain sense. It can override the laws of New Hampshire, for example, right? So can you explain that in a little bit of detail? I would like to understand how that has come about and what other states have any special carve-outs.
You did miss, I did cover that.
Oh, okay.
But
Then
no,
never mind.
I'll repeat it because, what I mentioned when the original Clean Air Act was passed, California was grandfathered into that because California already had a program underway and it had the major air pollution problem in Los Angeles. So in fact, California can set its own standards, particularly for now. The one thing is they can set their own standards, but they do require a waiver from EPA. Now, typically that's been more or less a rubber stamp, although in the early 2000s, Schwarzenegger had to fight on that until Bush actually granted that waiver. So now, as things move ahead with this administration, you hear sometimes they'll threat they will withhold the waiver or not. But that's the reason, is because of that grandfather there. But I think, EPA in some of those cases still has control, can have control.
What happened to the Volkswagen vehicles that were sold in California? Once it was proved that they were cheating, what happened to the actual vehicles?
Well, the VW is buying back a lot of those vehicles. They're pretty generous settlements. I don't know them. I think I don't know the numbers because I never had one. But they're buying those back, and people who bought them actually have come out well ahead. So they've used them a period of time. They've bought the vehicles back, and obviously they'll have to be crushed, or the engines taken out and crushed and whatnot. So they're not allowed to operate.
One more question.
So with creating those emissions targets, what kind of economic analysis goes into creating them? Such as do you guys study whether it's economically possible for the firms to meet those targets?
Yeah, that's always part of the economic analysis. So I'll give you one specific example. When we were setting the greenhouse gas targets for automobiles, the manufacturers said that would cost $3,000 for each vehicle in order to meet those standards. Staff analysis came up with it's probably around $1,000 or less. And the basis for that was that if you looked historically at during the hearings, what was estimated by the industry and what some of the staff had calculated there, industry was typically 2, 3, 5 times more than that. Now part of that would be, obviously, you're inflating those numbers to show it's difficult. But it's also part of it, once they settle down to do that and the industry has to do it all, costs do come down. But costs are into that. In fact, during the debate, typically, once you have a piece of legislation, then it goes to the agency to develop the regulation, how you do it. That can be a period of at least a year, where you have many public workshops where information is brought in, you meet with the regulated community, you understand what they're doing. Staff has to do an economic analysis, what that means, or a feasibility analysis as well. Because obviously if it's not feasible, it doesn't happen. So that part is done. And I also remember one where staff brought, when I was chair, they brought a regulation to regulate indoor motors on boats. And I'd listened to the regulated community, and they complained that that's not feasible and so on. So I sent the staff, I said, have you been out and looked at what they're doing? And no. So I insisted that the staff goes out. They understood what the issue was, that the regulation was refined because they could understand what the industry was saying, and regulation went forward. So, you know, you can have that back and forth. And as I'm trying to illustrate there, staff doesn't always get it right. 98% of the time or 95% of the time they do. But, you know, obviously the affected industry, they have a lot of expertise as well.
Well, with that, join me in thanking Dr. Lloyd